On May 15, 2011, the Catacombs of St. Clair, a small town in Missouri, had always possessed an aura of magic. While most locals viewed the catacombs as nothing more than old tunnels, for tourists, the place was a promise of mysteries and legends. At the heart of all these stories stood Ethan Rivers, a charismatic tour guide with a captivating voice and an inexhaustible knowledge of every corner of the underground. At 37, he had devoted a decade of his life to exploring these tunnels day and night. That Sunday afternoon, he began his usual tour, leading a group of 13 tourists through the dimly lit, narrow corridors. Every tour started with the same story, which had become the hallmark of the catacombs and Ethan himself. In 1932, during the Great Depression, banker Henry Marshall, known for his secrecy and risky decisions, disappeared in these tunnels with a large sum of money. He left his creditors empty-handed and fled, but no one knows what happened next. His body was never found, and the catacombs have kept this secret forever. As he spoke, Ethan carefully watched his audience's reactions. The tourists were mesmerized, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and curiosity. It was these emotions that had kept him going all these years. Stopping in front of one of the stone arches, he finished the tale. Some believe that Henry took his secrets with him, but at night in these tunnels you can still hear his footsteps. Maybe he's still searching for a way out. At 6:10 p.m. on May 15th, when the last tourist had made their way to the surface, Ethan stayed behind. He often stayed late, checking the tunnels, inspecting their condition, or looking for something new. That evening, he had a specific reason for being there. A construction project was scheduled in the western part of the catacombs due to ground instability. He needed to ensure that the area was safe for the workers. With a flashlight in hand, he descended into an old section of the catacombs, one that hadn't been visited by tourists in years. This part always felt special to him. The walls were covered in ancient markings that resembled symbols, and the air smelled thick with dampness. At 6:45 p.m., he noticed that one of the walls appeared different from usual. The stones were unusually smooth, as if they had been recently replaced. He touched them and felt a faint draft. Something's not right, he thought, taking out a tool to gently tap on the wall. After a few strikes, part of the stones crumbled, revealing a dark passage. It was an unknown tunnel that hadn't been mentioned in any of the plans or old records. Ethan paused for a moment. His heart raced and his hands trembled slightly. He had studied these catacombs for years and was confident he knew every inch of them. But before him lay a hidden section, concealed for decades. The tunnel was narrower than the usual corridors, and the air inside was thick and stale. Ethan carefully moved forward, shining his flashlight ahead. The ground beneath his feet creaked, as though old wood was cracking. A few meters in, he came across a strange object, a weathered leather briefcase. The metal buckles had rusted, but the shape was still recognizable. It was something from the past. He bent down to pick it up, but his attention was immediately drawn to a sound that made him flinch. It was a faint rustling, as if someone or something was moving in the darkness ahead. The flashlight illuminated only the outlines of the walls, but nothing else could be seen. A wave of anxiety washed over Ethan. Maybe it's just a rat, he told himself, though the sound was too loud for a creature of that size. He knelt, holding the briefcase in his hand, and tried to steady his breath. But the rustling came again, this time closer. When he finally emerged from the tunnel, the darkness outside had already replaced the twilight. Nothing seemed amiss on the surface, but thoughts of the hidden passage in the briefcase kept him uneasy. He ascended to his office, located near the main entrance of the catacombs, and began inspecting the find. Inside the briefcase were old papers, most of which had been damaged by time. However, one page caught his attention, a list of numbers and the signature Henry M. At that moment, Ethan's heart began to race. He was holding something that could have belonged to the very banker he had been telling stories about for years. At 11:40 p.m., the night found Ethan deep in thought. He sat in his office, flipping through old maps and records, trying to uncover any clue about the origin of this tunnel. His mind swirled with questions. Why was this passage sealed? What did the numbers on the papers mean? And most importantly, was this really a trace of Henry Marshall? That night, Ethan didn't sleep. His fascination with the catacombs had turned into obsession. He decided that the next day he would return to the tunnel, but this time, better prepared. St. Clair had always seemed like a quiet town, where the greatest secrets were hidden beneath the earth. Now Ethan knew he was on the brink of a discovery that could change everything he thought he knew about these catacombs. On May 16, 2011, at 8:30 p.m., Ethan Rivers, the tour guide of St. Clair's catacombs, felt his life change as he stood on the brink of new discoveries. After finding the mysterious tunnel and the leather briefcase which likely belonged to Henry Marshall, a banker who disappeared in 1932 with a large sum of money, Ethan felt as though he had uncovered the key to a long-forgotten secret. The tunnel he had discovered hours earlier was not part of the catacombs' original plan, which meant that before him lay not just a new passage, but an entire hidden story that had been buried underground for decades. Ethan decided to return to the spot where the stones had collapsed, revealing the tunnel, to investigate further. He already felt that this place held more than just ordinary stone corridors. Descending into the darkness of the catacombs once again, flashlight in hand, he realized that this discovery was more than just a new passage. Something important, and likely dangerous, awaited him. The tunnel was narrow and sloped, but Ethan pressed on. After a few meters, he noticed that the walls around him were different from the rest of the catacombs. The stones were smoother, and in some places he saw markings that didn't fit the natural decay of the tunnel. Suddenly, he came upon a massive metal door. This was no ordinary part of the catacombs. It was likely a hidden vault, concealed from prying eyes. In front of the door stood a copper lock which appeared untouched by time. Behind the flashlight, a dark corridor unfolded, and while there were no signs of decay, the place was striking in its scale and mystery. Every movement echoed in this gloomy space, and Ethan could feel a cold sweat forming on his brow. He pulled out tools from his bag and attempted to open the lock. However, the door didn't budge, and feeling his heartbeat faster, Ethan decided to continue exploring the tunnel, looking for another way inside. This wasn't just a matter of curiosity. It was an attempt to understand what lay hidden in this concealed passage. And why was it locked? A few minutes later, while inspecting his surroundings, Ethan noticed familiar symbols on the walls that seemed to point to hidden pathways. He compared them with the records he had studied earlier and realized these markings were part of a larger plan. Digging deeper, he uncovered a small table containing the inscription, "Old Vault." These words made him pause, as they suggested he might have discovered an old bank vault that was scheduled to be closed within a month. These discoveries gave him a new purpose. With each step, Ethan felt as though the ground beneath him was crumbling away from everything he had once believed. The St. Clair catacombs had become more than just a place for tours. They were a labyrinth tangled in a massive secret. Why had this tunnel been hidden for so long? What had happened to the bank when Henry Marshall vanished? And most importantly, why had this vault remained concealed? Meanwhile, on the surface, the catacombs remained unchanged. The town of St. Clair had no idea that beneath its feet, a transformation was unfolding that could alter their history. Time seemed to move more slowly here. Yet for Ethan, the catacombs had become the place where, with each discovery, he was getting closer to unraveling a mystery that likely held the keys to the secrets behind money, politics, and covert dealings. Despite the growing excitement, he couldn't abandon his investigation. What if the catacombs held more than just a bank vault? What if Henry Marshall and his fate had truly influenced the events that unfolded in the town? How long had this been part of the vast, unnoticed game hidden underground? Ethan returned to the surface, but he was no longer the same tour guide who shared old legends with tourists. He had become part of the story that likely still needed to be solved. This tunnel had become his own puzzle, and he knew that only by continuing his investigation could he find the answers to all his questions. St. Clair, with its ancient catacombs, no longer seemed to him like a peaceful town where secrets were mere fantasies. Now, every step and every new clue was becoming part of an even bigger, darker, and more dangerous game. On May 16, 2011, at 9:30 a.m., Ethan Rivers sat in his office, going through old records, maps, and documents. With every new discovery he made in the St. Clair catacombs, he became increasingly aware that he was entangled in something much bigger than just an ancient mystery. The tunnel leading to the bank vault and the leather briefcase that belonged to Henry Marshall had become only part of this vast game. Everything began to look like a plan that had been kept secret for decades. Ethan understood that in order to get to the bottom of this story, he would need help. And it wasn't just about getting help from friends, it was about taking risks, being ready to go all the way despite the dangers. He needed to choose people he could trust. They had to be more than just acquaintances. They had to be true professionals, ready to overcome obstacles, even if those obstacles were much greater than they could imagine. The choice was obvious. The first person Ethan decided to contact was his longtime friend, Emily Stockton. She was a bank security expert, and although her career had recently suffered a setback after losing her job at a large financial institution, Ethan knew she was the best in her field. She had deep knowledge of security systems, including how to bypass the most complex security measures. At 11 a.m. on May 16, 2011, Ethan dialed Emily's number. His hand trembled slightly as he heard the familiar voice on the other end of the line. They hadn't spoken in a while, but there had always been a mysterious connection between them that allowed them to understand each other without words. After a few minutes of conversation, he laid out his ideas. Emily agreed to meet. Her reaction was calm, but there was curiosity in her voice, perhaps stemming from her own frustration and a desire to be part of something important again. She had always been cautious, but also ready for big challenges. At 2:30 p.m. on May 16, 2011, they met at a local cafe. Emily looked serious, but her gaze revealed her interest. She quickly understood why she had been invited. It wasn't just about exploring ancient tunnels. This was a plan that could change everything. Ethan told her about the vault he had found and what had happened to the bank and its property. He explained that this wasn't just a matter of money, but a story that needed to be unraveled. Emily immediately appreciated the complexity of the task. Her thoughts quickly shifted to the practical aspects. She recalled several complex security systems that could be in their way and was already starting to devise a plan of action. She promised to help, and noted that it would be best for her to focus on planning the security strategy and bypassing cameras, alarm systems, and other obstacles. To carry out this task, Ethan needed 2 more specialists. He immediately thought of Sean Lark, a tech genius he had known since his student days. Sean was an inventor who could bypass any system and break any limitation. His knowledge of electronics and programming was invaluable, and he was always ready to tackle any challenging task, even if it was on the edge of legality. At 9 a.m. on May 17, 2011, Ethan met Sean in his workshop. It was evident in Sean's eyes, just like in Emily's voice, the desire to dive into something new and feel alive again. Sean eagerly agreed to join the team, understanding that this would be more than just another challenge for him. It was an opportunity to be part of something much bigger. Sean promised to help with jamming the bank's security cameras to prevent them from recording what was being planned. The final member of their team was Ben Carter, someone Ethan had known from his tour guide days. Ben was one of the best safecrackers Ethan had ever met. But of all his skills, the most interesting was his ability to work under immense pressure, which was crucial for their plan. Ben wasn't afraid to take risks, and he had been in high-stress situations many times when others had already given up. At 4:30 p.m. on May 17, 2011, they gathered at a familiar location to discuss the plan. Each of them was experienced in their respective field, but what they were planning to do wasn't going to be easy. They all understood that danger awaited them, but the feeling of challenge and a shared goal made them strong. They knew that together they could overcome all obstacles and do the impossible. Once everything was agreed upon, Ethan felt the weight of uncertainty beginning to lift. They already had a team, and each person was ready to play their part. Emily started drafting a detailed plan to bypass security systems. Sean prepared devices to jam the cameras, and Ben was already contemplating the strategy for dealing with the safes. As for Ethan, he was preparing to finally uncover the secret that had been hidden beneath the city for a century. They all knew that their future depended on these actions. They were ready for the risk, the danger, and even the consequences. But most importantly, they were ready to uncover the truth. and whatever happened, their fates were already intertwined with the St. Clair catacombs. On May 18, 2011 at 10:15 a.m., Ethan Rivers was finishing a tour for tourists when his eyes, for some unknown reason, lingered on an old stone wall. He had long been accustomed to weathered surfaces covered with cracks, but this time something seemed different. Over the past few days, as he conducted more tours, he had gradually immersed himself in his thoughts, trying to envision all the possible ways their plan could unfold. But this time he stopped, unable to shake the thought of how that final step would unfold, the one that would bring them to their goal. On the surface, it seemed like a typical reconnaissance mission. As a tour guide, he could easily walk through the catacombs, pretending it was all part of the program for tourists. But in reality, it was part of his preparation. Every step, every turn in the corridor, every stair he climbed was measured as part of a grand scheme. He was calculating the time it would take to move from one location to another, so that he would know exactly how long the team would need to execute their part of the plan. Later that day, at 1 p.m., he met with Emily to discuss the next details. Their plan was both simple and complex. The tunnel they had found was a forgotten passage leading to the bank's vault, and they were confident it would be their primary route to the target. However, there were numerous dangers around it that could affect their success. The security systems of the catacombs could not be ignored. Emily had started devising a plan to bypass the cameras and sensors. She had already calculated which sections of the tunnels would require the least effort to pass through unnoticed. Considering that the bank's security system was designed to prevent any attempts at intrusion, her task was to find ways the team could avoid detection. She was calculating the time needed to complete each stage and thinking about possible unforeseen situations. Her mind was working at full capacity, knowing that every minute would count. At 4 p.m. the same day, Ethan met with Sean and Ben in the old part of the catacombs. This area had long been out of use for tours, and as a result, wasn't well lit. They set up their equipment and decided to test a new tactic. Sean brought several new jamming devices to ensure that the cameras would be blind, and the connection to the bank's security would remain undetected. He connected them to the old systems, testing how effectively they could disrupt the signal. Ben, for his part, was testing his own equipment for working with safes. He was a natural safe cracker, and even in the darkness of the old tunnels, he could silently reach the most complex mechanisms. This time, he had to practice on old doors leading to the vault. Every move he made was careful and calculated, knowing that he would have to work under pressure when time was limited. At 6:30 p.m. on May 18, 2011, the team gathered in one of the dark corridors where there were no security systems yet. They were reviewing their routes. Each person was thinking about their task, fully aware that every detail mattered. While Emily was testing her methods for bypassing the cameras, Sean and Ben were fine-tuning their techniques to ensure their capabilities were flawless. Sean was jamming signals, testing how effectively his devices worked, while Ben was testing different methods for cracking safes. Every action they took had to be perfect. The most difficult part was timing. Ethan was convinced that for success, every member had to work precisely, with no delays. Every process had to be calculated down to the second, and so he kept counting the time, assessing how long it would take to get through each part of the tunnel, from one section to the next. On May 19, 2011, at 12 p.m., the team met to review the results of their training. They checked the escape route, the one that would be used for their exit. The route they had chosen had to be not only fast but also as safe as possible. It was important not only to avoid detection by security, but also to leave the catacombs without delay. Each member worked on their part. Emily was planning the bypasses, Sean was testing the signals, and Ben was fine-tuning his silent safe-cracking methods. Ethan, once again, was reviewing maps and considering the perfect moment to take action. Meanwhile, his mind couldn't stop wondering how it would all end. He realized that their team couldn't afford to make a mistake. All the steps had been calculated, but even with the best preparation, there was always the element of chance. At 6 p.m. on May 19, 2011, the lights in the catacombs dimmed, and only shadows remained. Ethan felt his nerves rising with each passing hour. They were approaching the moment of truth, and although they were all ready, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was one detail they might have overlooked. And though time showed no mercy, Ethan couldn't help but reflect on how crucial it was to stay calm until the very end. This was their only chance. How they executed the plan would determine their fate. On May 27, 2011, at 8:20 a.m., Ethan Rivers descended into the tunnel. His flashlight illuminated the narrow, damp passage, and the stone walls, covered in mold, cast eerie shadows. The atmosphere was oppressive, as if the earth itself was hinting that an intrusion here could end in catastrophe. This was supposed to be the final test of the tunnel before the big day, when their plan was to unfold into flawless reality. Behind him in silence walked the team. Emily Stockton, whose face reflected hidden anxiety, was focused on each step. Her confidence as a security expert had recently been shaken by unexpected changes in the tunnels. Sean Lark, the technical genius, held portable devices to measure the humidity and stability of the walls. Behind them walked Ben Carter, silent and tense, his caution understandable for someone used to working with safes, not underground labyrinths. The tunnel was unusually damp. Humidity hung in the air, penetrating every breath. Ethan tried to focus, but his thoughts kept drifting due to the uncomfortable pressure in his chest. He knew time was working against them. Their plan was to take place exactly 6 days from now, and the unknown factors could ruin everything. At 9:45, the team reached a narrow passage leading to the main tunnel. It seemed the walls here were even wetter. A thin layer of water ran over the stone, leaving marks on the floor. Emily bent down, touched the moisture, and stopped, looking over the walls with noticeable concern. There was an uncertainty in her eyes that seemed unusual for her usually cold composure. As they continued, they came upon the spot where they had planned to create a passage to the bank vault. Sean stepped closer, took out one of his devices, and carefully touched the wall. At 10:30, the silence was shattered by a crack that echoed through the tunnel, like a sinister signal. In the next moment, part of the wall collapsed. Stones fell with a deep thud, scattering in all directions. Dust filled the narrow space, and everyone instinctively covered their faces with their hands. Ethan reflexively grabbed Sean by the shoulder and pulled him back, saving him from being struck by debris. When the noise subsided and the dust began to settle, they were left with only the rubble. The air vibrated with tension, and each of them realized just how dangerous these catacombs had become. Sean silently brushed the dust off his jacket, but his face showed restrained fear. His usual confident movements had become nervous, and his eyes constantly scanned the damaged walls. For him, technology had always been a safe zone, but now this place was beyond any control. Emily, who usually remained calm, was visibly shaken. She stared at the collapse, clutching her flashlight so tightly her fingers whitened. Her thoughts were clear. The catacombs they had planned to use as an advantage were now becoming their enemy. Her anxiety grew as they continued on their way. By 11:15, the team reached a section where underground water began to break through the walls. Thin streams turned into small flows, running across the tunnel floor. The puddles grew larger with every minute, and the floor became slippery and dangerous. Ethan stopped and stared at this unexpected flow, feeling a cold dread. He realized this could become a serious threat. Sean checked the humidity levels, and with a serious expression he announced, "The underground water levels are rising. If this continues, they'll flood our way back." This news hit the team hard. Ben remained silent, standing a little apart and not looking at anyone. But it was clear he'd begun to doubt the viability of the mission. His movements had become hesitant, something Ethan had never noticed before. At 12:30, returning to the starting point, the tension within the group reached its peak. The atmosphere was oppressive, as if each of them was trying to gather their thoughts. Emily, unable to hold back any longer, turned to Ethan with a direct and cold gaze. Her anxiety had turned into suspicion, which exploded when she realized how personal this plan had become for Ethan. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He felt his thoughts dive into the past, back to the moments when his parents had lost everything because of the bank. He avoided direct eye contact with the others, knowing the truth could destroy their trust. But his silence spoke louder than any words. That evening, at 6:45 p.m., they emerged to the surface. Their faces were serious and exhausted, The catacombs had proven more difficult than they had expected, testing them not only physically, but emotionally. Emily remained upset, Sean looked drained, and Ben was detached. Ethan stood apart, staring into the darkness of the entrance to the catacombs. He knew their team had reached a breaking point, but he also knew, for him, this was more than just a heist. It was his personal mission, one he could not abandon. On June 4, 2011 at 11:50 p.m., Ethan's team gathered for the final stage before entering the catacomb tunnels. The cold water had already reached their knees, and everyone understood that their plan was now working against the clock. In 1 hour, the water level could become critical. The tension was almost palpable in the air. Sean was checking his devices, Ben silently stared into the darkness, and Emily, whose expression was always composed, nervously gripped the tunnel map in her hands. At 12:05 a.m., they reached the point where the tunnel connected with the old vault wall. The water level here was much lower, giving them hope. In this section of the catacombs, the structure could hold. Emily confirmed that this was the right spot. Ethan knew that any delay now could turn into catastrophe, but his hands trembled slightly as he connected the explosives, disguised as old construction material. At 12:12 a.m., the explosion went off. Quiet, controlled, but enough to destroy part of the wall. A small opening revealed the path to the bank vault. Inside, there was absolute silence. The guards were several floors above them, completely unaware of the intrusion. At 12:18 a.m., the team quickly made their way inside. Ben immediately set to work on the safes. His movements were precise and honed. Years of training had made him a professional. Emily, in the meantime, tried to remain vigilant, constantly checking the data from Sean's device, which was supposed to block the alarm. Sean, in turn, looked tense. He was constantly adjusting the settings, as though fearing something would go wrong. At 12:30 a.m., the safes were opened. Inside were dozens of stacks of banknotes, each with weight not only in the literal sense, but in a symbolic one. $13 million, more than any of them could have imagined. But for Ethan, it wasn't just about the money. This was a moment of revenge, proof that he could outsmart the system that had destroyed his family. At 12:35 a.m., they loaded the money into special waterproof bags. This was a moment of triumph, but Ethan felt the joy was premature. A sense of dread lingered, but he didn't have time to voice his concerns. At 12:38 a.m. it happened. A barely audible sound of the alarm cut through the silence. Sean, with a guilty expression, tried to explain, "I forgot about the backup system." But the words were unnecessary. Everyone knew they now had only minutes to escape. At 12:40 a.m. they rushed back into the tunnel. The water, which had previously been knee-deep, was now rising almost to their waists. The flow was getting stronger, pressing against the walls. Emily, holding the map, shouted directions, but her voice sometimes got lost in the roar of the rushing water. At 12:45 a.m., the water burst through one of the walls in the left tunnel, forcing them to change their route. Emily looked bewildered and Ben looked angry. Ethan understood that the loss of control over the situation was heightening their internal conflicts, but he had no time for discussion. At 12:50 a.m., they reached a fork in the tunnel. Emily ordered them to go right, but Ethan noticed that this path was already partially flooded. "We can't go that way," he shouted, pointing to an alternative route. Emily hesitated for a second but agreed. At 12:55 a.m., the alarm had spread throughout the bank. In the distance, they could hear the footsteps of the guards descending. They were getting closer. Time seemed to slow down for Ethan, and each second felt like an eternity. On June 4, 2011, at 1 a.m., the team was still in the safe zone of the tunnels. They were almost at the finish line, but the water continued to rise. Now it reached their chests, and every step required superhuman effort. Fatigue and tension were draining them, but the gleam of the millions they carried kept them moving. Ethan was leading the way, cutting through the strong current. His mind kept running through the details. Had everything gone according to plan? Had they left any traces? But there was also a strange sense of unease growing inside him. Something about Emily and Ben's behavior seemed off. Ben kept looking over his shoulder, and Emily was strangely hurried, not waiting for him to confirm the route. At 1:15 a.m., they reached another fork. The water here seemed calmer, which made Ethan suspicious. too calm for a place that had just threatened their lives. "Is this the way out?" he asked, trying to mask his doubt. Emily nodded curtly. A few seconds later, Ben suddenly grabbed him by the shoulders and shoved him into the deeper side of the water. Ethan lost his balance and fell into the current. At that moment, he realized that everything that had been bothering him was true. At 1:20 a.m., Emily, holding the waterproof bag with the money, looked down at him from above. Her face no longer showed fear or tension. Instead, there was cold determination. "Don't blame us, this is just business," she said, and her voice sounded alien to him. He tried to rise, but Ben stood between him and the exit, blocking any chance of escape. The water pressed harder, growing stronger with every second. At 1:25 a.m., it became clear that this had been premeditated. Emily and Ben had been working with the bank to stage the heist, making it look convincing for the insurance company. They had used him as a convenient pawn, and now they were leaving him to die in the flooded catacombs. "Your job's over, Ethan," Ben said, before both of them disappeared into the darkness of the tunnel. Left alone with the rising water, Ethan felt rage intertwining with despair. He knew no one would come to save him. Every time he tried to rise, the current knocked him back down. At 1:30 a.m., the water level rose even higher. Ethan began using everything around him to keep himself afloat. He remembered an old ventilation shaft nearby, one he had noticed during his reconnaissance. This was his only chance. At 1:35 a.m., despite the overwhelming fatigue, he reached the shaft. The water had already reached the ceiling of the tunnel, leaving him only a few minutes. He tried to pull himself up, but the slippery walls and his wet clothes made it nearly impossible. At 1:40 a.m., when he was on the verge of losing hope, he managed to grab onto a ledge and pull himself up to the ventilation shaft. The water was now at chest level, but it had stopped rising. Taking a deep breath, he felt a surge of determination. At 1:45 a.m., he realized that now he had only one thing left: to escape and find Emily and Ben. The feeling of betrayal burned in him stronger than the fear of death. This was no longer about money or the success of the plan. It had become personal. At that moment, Ethan knew one thing for sure: he wouldn't let this go. On June 5th, 2011, at 2:30 a.m., the water in the catacombs began to recede, and Ethan realized he was no longer its prisoner. The time he had spent in these deadly tunnels seemed to stretch for hours, but every minute was crucial for his survival. Now he was no longer just a victim or part of the large scheme Ben and Emily had orchestrated. His desire for revenge had become so strong that neither the cold nor the dampness could stop him. All his rage was now focused on one thought: to find at least a portion of the money he had hidden earlier in these catacombs and escape this hell alive. He was lucky that a few hours before the water level rose, he had taken part of the money from the place where it was originally supposed to be. Not all the money, of course, just a portion, enough to make a fresh start. At 2:45 a.m., he reached an old entrance to one of the narrow shafts where he had previously hidden bags of dollars. Now, as he climbed up, his whole world was turned upside down. The feeling of leaving behind those who had betrayed him was not only physical, but also emotional. He felt like someone rising from the dead, but this time as a different person, a person who no longer belonged to that world. By 3 a.m., when he finally emerged from the catacombs, he no longer thought about total success or failure. He realized that what mattered most now was finding a place where he could leave this dark chapter of his life behind and begin anew. It was hard to even imagine how his fate would change, but it was at that moment he understood that the world would never be the same for him. Now, he was the ghost of the catacombs. Weeks after emerging to the surface, he changed his appearance, name, and place of residence. He became less noticeable and more cautious, but inside, one truth remained. Everything that had happened was not the end. The money he had hidden in the catacombs was not just the key to a new life, but also part of his revenge. He wouldn't let anyone forget what had happened to him. However, Ethan wasn't like a typical fugitive. He left a trace behind, but this trace was such that no one could find him easily. Every step, every gesture became part of his new plan, his plan to leave clues. He left invisible marks for those who sought sensationalism, for the new adventurers. He knew that such a story couldn't go unnoticed. People were too curious, and his revenge lay in making any new arrivals who got lost in those catacombs remember that the real story was still alive. At 3:30 a.m., he began hiding the first clues, small parts of the story that could lead to his true legacy. In familiar places he often passed at night, Ethan left old maps, insignificant pieces of metal, or parts of photographs where only one detail was visible: his face, which could now belong to no one else. People who saw these traces might complicate their fate if they chose to learn the truth. He was sure that over time, someone would understand what all of this would lead to. By 4 a.m. on June 6, 2011, Ethan was already far from the catacombs. He had changed his name and there was no place for the old ghosts in his new life. But in reality, this wasn't just an ordinary rebirth. It was a moment when he didn't just escape. He left a part of himself in those catacombs, in the form of clues that would remind others of him and everything that had happened. Naturally, all of this had been carefully planned. He wasn't seeking to be made into a hero or a criminal. Ethan was no longer just a part of a grand game he couldn't control. Now he was the one who set the rules of the game. And for those who dared to follow the clues, the true story would be very different. A story of betrayal, struggle, and new hope. He could leave his past behind, but the process of transformation and struggle left an imprint on him. He had become a ghost, but not like any other. This was a ghost who didn't seek salvation, but had the power to influence those who entered his labyrinth.